My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast. Listeners, we are doing something a little different today. We are going to be discussing the Wolf of Winhall, a classic module from the German fantasy role-playing game The Dark Eye, but it's not going to be Tom and I talking about it. Tom, what are we doing today?
Yeah, so as you'll have noticed, Jason, the number of speaking roles in the intro has increased by 50% for this episode. The thing with the Wolf of Winhall, or Der Wolf von Winhall, if I've got that right, is that it's in German, which presented an obstacle in that, with all due respect to yourself, you don't speak German.
I do not, no.
No, so reviewing it was always going to be a bit tricky. We did consider a sort of thing where I would do an appalling translation, give it to you in English to read, but that seemed suboptimal. So we decided what we needed was a German, or possibly an Austrian or other, German speaker. And we found one. So Verena very kindly got in touch and offered to be the other half of the discussion.
They found us.
Yeah.
In some sense.
So she is of German extraction. She's born in Germany, lives now on the west coast of America. So she has a good knowledge of both kind of English language and German language role-playing games, and in fact has been running lots of Das Schwarze Auge modules for her gaming group, but in English, so she was kind of the perfect person to talk to about this adventure.
No, I'm very excited to hear it. I would imagine that the way you would approach this conversation is that there would be a lot of compare and contrast between Das Schwarze Auge and, say, D&D, or I suppose Warhammer. Is that kind of what we're going to look forward to here?
Yeah. So there's a fair amount of that comes up, because I was running this when I did it just from the module without really any knowledge of the overall background. So a lot of my questions are, is this a thing in Das Schwarze Auge, or is it just in this adventure? Or, what makes this particularly classic? Yeah. We talked a fair bit about that. And then the other thing that we talk about, especially in the Expert Delve, is the language barrier. One of my things is I'm often trying to encourage people to try and take the leap beyond like the one language they know really well, and try and at least explore and look at the artwork and maps and stuff in non-English language gaming products, because there's so much stuff out there. So we talked a bit about the practicalities of, if you're not that good at, say, Spanish, what can you get from a Spanish adventure or game? Verena also, by the way, is a language teacher, so she was, again, knows exactly how to kind of benchmark this sort of stuff. That's another aspect of the conversation.
Well, I'm very excited to go listen to it, so why don't we do that now, and we'll meet up again on the other side.
Yeah, we'll be back afterwards to find out what you think.
All right, see you in a bit.
See you. My name is Tom.
And my name is Verena.
Und das ist Angst vor einem schwarzen Drachen, ein alte Schule Rollenspieler Podcast.
And when it comes to German role-playing games, it doesn't get much more old school than Das Schwarze Auges Der Wolf von Winhall.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. Der Wolf von Winhall is a 30-page adventure published in 1988 for Das Schwarze Auge by Schmidt-Spieler and Drumer Knauer. It was written by Thomas Romer and has cover art by Jan Yudze with interior illustrations by Jochen Fortman. And we are reviewing the PDF reissue by Ulysses from 2013. But before we continue with the basic crawl, I think we need to introduce the interloping voice in the room. Verena, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us for this very special Teutonic episode. Could you introduce yourself briefly to the listeners, maybe give a bit of your gaming background and so on?
Sure thing, Tom. Thanks for having me. Well, so I heard that, I think it was Jason mentioned that you were looking for somebody who spoke German to help with a German module for The Dark Eye, or Das Schwarze Auge. And I was like, hey, that's like the background that I have. I grew up playing this game. I think I started playing this game when I was 11. So definitely a lot of nostalgia there for The Dark Eye for me here. So I got in touch, and I'm very thrilled to be here and talk about it.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So yeah, let's talk about the module. I've done a rough translation of the back of the book text to give people an idea of what happens. And it goes like this. A werewolf is abroad near Winhall. Someone has to deal with it and free the land of this menace. A werewolf against a handful of experienced heroes. Not a difficult task, one would think. But the Wolf of Winhall seems to have something special about it. Why else would the Emperor have personally sent his Grand Inquisitor? Will the heroes succeed in getting to the werewolf ahead of this professional monster hunter? Or will they get caught between the two? Turning to the actual contents of the book, it starts off with your traditional background, bit of adventure information for the GM, some newspaper clippings from the Havana Fanfare, which give rumours and info, and then the Overland to Winhall chapter, so travelling to the starting point of the adventure. That includes required encounters, sharing rumours and so on, and then a part in the town of Winhall itself. At this point, the rival monster hunter, the Inquisitor Dexter Nemrod, arrives. The next section is called Heading North. This is going through the forests to the Manor House, a kind of wolf-themed mansion dungeon crawl where the wolf is believed to be lurking. However, there's a crucial episode here when the PCs finally track down, kill the werewolf, which is A Werewolf Confesses, and we get the real story of what happened. The TLDR version, Aluris, the pharmacy guy who sent them on the mission, is the real villain. Shortly after this, the villain strikes. He sends a bunch of monsters to the manor to eliminate the PCs. The Inquisitor shows up, he too is defeated, and then back in Winhall, there is firstly an episode called The Attack. It's a box of deadly mosquitoes. Then there is the pharmacy, which presumes an invasion of Aluris, the pharmacist's house. And finally, there's the fight in the poison kitchen, which is the final showdown. Then we get rewards and departures, the end of the adventure, and appendices with the scenario events timeline, the NPC write-ups, brief treatise on lycanthropy, some new elixirs and magical items, and maps of the town of Winhall, the manor, Aluris' house, the nearby forest, and the broader region. So, let's establish our bona fides on this scenario. Verena, how have you used this in your gaming?
So I'm currently in the middle of running it with 3 players, and I'm using the 5th edition of The Dark Eye, which has been translated into English, so I'm using the English version there.
I ran a Trophy Gold play-by-post for 2 players via Discord, and that took us about 3 months with a relatively slow turnaround time and the traditional long lapses where someone forgets to post anything for ages. Well, let's talk first then about what we liked about the module. Do you have any initial thoughts, Verena?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the cover makes me very nostalgic. Just the cover art is very stark. The werewolf looks really scary and almost caricature-like. And it's a scene of the werewolf looking on people, like a family having dinner and looking very scared. And it just makes me really happy to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that familiar with the artist, but this is sort of the classic DSA look, right, from the 80s and 90s? Is that right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everybody who sees these covers will remember the artist and go like, oh, yeah, that's old-style Dark Eye stuff. So, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, the interior illustrations, I would say, are not quite up to this standard. Perhaps done quite quickly. There are 1 or 2 that are okay, but they're sort of black and white pencil drawings. It's not a key draw for this.
No, nothing to write home about, and that's always been this way in the older versions. It seems like the money was spent on the cover, but the interior design, was often done, from what I hear, by friends of the authors.
Really? I mean, that's it, because I don't want to kind of throw aspersions at the artist, but like you look at it, it's either someone who's sort of doing it non-professionally, or they were maybe given like a 2-hour turnaround time. Like, quick, we need a picture of a wolf.
Yeah, it's very dilettantish, yeah.
Yeah. But talking of the art style, though, I want to mention the maps. Again, I think this is quite common in classic the Schwarze Auge. I think they're very stark, like these black and white maps with like clearly just utilitarian with quite thick grid squares all over them. Like, there's nothing attractive about them. And yet, after a while, I kind of started to like them. I don't know why.
I think they're really clear. I feel like in-game they work really well, which is why I also enjoyed having them.
Mm-hmm.
The Schwarze Auge, I have to give a little bit of background there, is notoriously kind of been criticized for railroading and just having like, here's the plot, and then putting GMs in that position of where they have to get PCs just kind of railroaded through a plot. I feel like this plot does a pretty good job of offering plan Bs, of not just saying here's what happens, but saying, like here's where that information can be found. But if that guy dies, then you can find his diary over here. So I feel like this is actually a really nice job there.
Yeah, there's definitely things it expects you to do. I thought, though, for example, the trek through the forest was quite nicely done. Like, you look at that region map, there's a whole bunch of different ways you could go. It sort of reminded me of Oh yeah, the Forest of Doom, I think it's called. The plan and the area you're traveling is quite similar, I would say. And yes, I mean, you have to go to the manor house eventually, but the way you do it is up to you. And there's loads of what I think is important for, you know, any horror adventure is loads of people telling you scary rumors and not to go the way that you're definitely going to go. And that, I think, was handled really well. Like, all the rumors are very foreboding. Like, they contradict each other completely, but they're all very foreboding. So, you know, whichever one is true, it's not going to be good. And in fact, I don't think any of them are... Oh, one or two of them are correct, but they're so cryptic that they're not that useful in practical terms.
Yeah, but I do agree that they really contribute to the atmosphere. This is probably the thing that I enjoyed the most about it. Just playing scared villagers was just really fun. The druid was really great too. Yandaha, I think is her name.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed playing her as well. That was a great scene. And she actually has a lot of good information to give. You know, then there's that whole rumor about the spring having silver in it, which is a total lie. Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of red herrings about that, which I enjoyed a lot.
Yeah, it's good. I think it gives a sense of, well, I found, in fact, it gave a sense of urgency. So obviously in Trophy, there's a whole thing about resting and recuperating. And I offered that opportunity a couple of times, and the players both went, oh, we better not stop for anything because more people are going to die if we take any breaks. So that was pretty good. Okay, yeah, we'll come to Dexter Nemrod last, I think. I quickly want to mention the two kind of dungeons that we get, quote-unquote dungeons. They're both just houses, big houses. One of them is the ruined manor, where the werewolf is making his lair, with a whole bunch of other scary wolves, by the way. And then the second one is I keep saying pharmacist, it's like apothecary, right?
Yeah.
The apothecary's house in the town. And on the surface, they look pretty similar. They're both big houses, but they felt really different in play, at least for us. The first one is this traditional kind of hostile environment. You could be savaged by a wolf whenever you open a door.
The use of wolves is so good. There's going to be a lot of like looking into rooms and then frantically trying to close doors and locking them and darring them somehow. It's real fun.
That's good. My guys were very cautious. They just burnt the whole manor down.
Oh, wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah. They were not up for tangling with wolves. But yeah, and then you get to the house in the town, and that's this sort of tense kind of manhunt thing. Because, of course, it's, spoiler alert, mostly empty. There's like one guy and his servants, and they're in the basement. But, of course, the players don't know that. So they're doing the whole SWAT team raid kind of deal. That, I think, it's a less developed scene than the manor house, but I think atmospherically it was more fun, at least for me.
Yeah, actually we're going to do that one next time, so hopefully it'll be as fun.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we've just been taking a little bit longer. It's I'm sure we're going to talk about that later, but it looks, when you read through it, looks very straightforward, very clear, and you think you're going to be able to do it quickly, but actually some things are going to take a lot longer in play.
Yeah, so how many sessions are you on at the moment?
We've just completed 2 sessions at about 3 hours each, but they've been, socially distanced in person, so, there's some socializing in there too.
Sure.
But yeah, I would say about 2.5 hours of play each, so about 5 hours of play.
Fair enough. And let's talk about the last element, what that I liked, which is Dexter Nemrod. Now, I will say one thing that's interesting for English-speaking players. Playing Der Schwarze Auge is what German role-playing game designers of the 80s thought kind of heroic Englishy names sounded like. Because I would not choose Dexter Nemrod for my Grand Inquisitor. I mean, obviously the derivations are pretty obvious. Nimrod the Hunter, Dexter the skillful guy, whatever. Now, he's like an iconic NPC character from the setting, right?
So the early authors of The Dark Eye continuously brought their own PCs into the game. And fun side fact, Thomas Römer's player character was Dexter Nemrod.
Man, that is super annoying.
It really is.
But what I liked about his appearance in this one was because, obviously we had nothing to go on. Like, this guy shows up, he's a big deal. And it does a good job of showing from all the townsfolk's reactions that he's a big deal. They don't just say his name and expect you to be impressed. They have everyone falling over themselves to go, oh, Dexter's here, we're all saved, it's all going to be brilliant. And then I don't know what his character's really supposed to be like, but I definitely played him as this sort of very pleased with himself, Lord Flashheart kind of guy. I wonder if that's how Thomas Römer played him in his game. I guess we'll never know.
We'll never know, though I just listened to an interview with him. So he's still around. It's possible to ask him, but I personally didn't. My last point is that I really enjoyed the adversary. Alurius is really fun to play because he has these two faces. So, there's going to be a time pretty early on after there's an attack on the PCs with poison. It's obvious that the apothecary is probably going to be involved in something that has poison, and my PCs really jumped on that, and they were going to shake him down, but he has these like two sides. So basically his day face and his night face, and the day face just completely said, nope, I have no idea what's going on, and it was really fun to play with that in the game.
Yeah, it's like the twist that it's him is barely a twist at all. Because my players also said, oh, maybe it's the apothecary guy. But they went, oh, well, he's given us all this useful stuff. Let's go get the werewolf. So yeah, it's not a, oh my goodness reveal, but it is a, I knew it reveal, which is as satisfying. Maybe more satisfying, actually. Yeah, I think it works really well. I don't know what you do if they correctly surmise that it's him. I guess you just have them storm through his house and have a fun action scene, don't worry about it. But yeah, I think the way it's presented, that was how it played out in my game, so I don't mind assumptions when they're correct.
My group was very close to just getting in there and shaking him down. And I was like, okay, that would be fine too. Let's sandbox it. But they ended up not doing that. But
nice.
It would have been fun.
So let's move on to things we had questions about. Yeah, I'd like to pull this back to a couple of broad questions I have. One is just a kind of historical curiosity. When I was looking up the info for this, why did the Dark Eye have two publishers in the 1980s? Do you know?
Yeah, I do, actually. I'm going to recommend a book in the Companion Adventures later that answered a lot of those questions for me. Das Schwarze Auge is basically the German answer to D&D. So at the time, the main author behind Das Schwarze Auge, Ulrich Kiesow, he was tasked with translating D&D, and then Schmidt-Spiele was going to buy it, and it ended up being too expensive in licensing. Instead, Schmidt-Spiele and then Drömer Knaue is a publishing company for books. They usually put out, novels. They joined forces and went in on Das Schwarze Auge together. Drömer Knaue pulled out in just barely after this module was published in '89. They were just like, we're not ready. This is not really our jam. But yeah, they were involved with it for about 5 years. And the reason was because they wanted to have these games both in kind of the game section of department stores. I remember going to the big department store, like Karstadt, places like that in Germany, and you could just buy them off the shelf. I think that's how I found out about this. Yeah. There were like TV ads, and they could also have them in bookstores.
Right.
That was the two-pronged approach to marketing there.
Okay, I see. My next question then is, drawing on your expertise and nostalgia, what would you say is particularly Das Schwarze Auge-ish about this scenario? I mean, I guess the real question is, what are the defining characteristics of the Dark Eye?
In some ways, I would say it is a little bit more dungeony than some of the plots that are... I mean, Dark Eye is always accused of being kind of pedestrian. And in some ways, I would say Der Wolf von Winhall is, right? It's not a big world-shaking plot. You're going after a werewolf and a town apothecary, right? So that would be pretty typical about it, I would say. Also, the appearance of kind of the big guy, Dexter Nemrod, is pretty typical. You will always have something to connect it to that living history. I would love for you to talk about, I just read your comment in the document, in the Google Doc. I would love to hear, have you looked into that living history aspect at all?
Yeah, this is the thing. So the comment, listeners, that Verena's referring to is... I found a line that I'd written as a side comment during our play-by-post, and I'll just quote myself to you now. It just says, "Oh God, I just wandered into a wiki for this setting. I am backing out slowly." So it's huge, and there's literally, I mean, all the publishing info I got from this is from the very comprehensive Das Schwarze Auge Wikipedia thing, which has loads of reviews and commentaries for every adventure as well, and how to buy it and all the versions. And then the setting is. Yeah, I got into a bit where I was finding myself... I know why it was. I was looking up the deities of the setting because I was a bit curious. There's a temple that you visit during it and no real details. So I thought, maybe I should look this up. once I'd found myself like 3 levels deep clicking through categories of religion in the setting, I thought, do you know what? I'm just going to make it up.
That is fair.
And that's what I did. It's really, there's a lot. I mean, it's been going for decades, so of course there's a lot. But I think from what I've heard, it's a particular thing for the developers to keep adding new stuff or keep getting ever more detail and establishing more about the setting.
Yeah, and it can be very infuriating. I mean, I have been playing in the setting for a long time, but I went away for a couple of years to get into more narrative games and things like that and just do something else. I think most of us do that, walk away from our first system. And when I came back, I was just like, okay, I have no idea what's going on here. There might be 1 or 2 ideas from the living history I bring in there, but I just make my own meta plot. I do not pay much attention to it. And I don't really expect to actually put Dexter Nemrod in the game. I think I'm just going to ignore him.
Fair enough.
Ha! Take that. Das Schwarze Auge.
Yeah, let's. I know you have some questions specifically about the module. Do you want to start off with one of them?
Sure, I'd love to hear what you've done. So that might be also a very typical thing about Das Schwarze Auge. There's kind of this pedagogical aspect to it almost. There's always this like, the heroes, quote unquote, as the PCs are referred to, could do this, but true heroes wouldn't do that. I don't know. I think that's even in this module.
I think that is in this one, I remember.
It's very pedagogical, very prescriptive, and that is not the only time that Das Schwarze Auge does that. So obviously, your playing style, from what I'm assuming, is going to allow for a little bit more leeway in moral choices. So how did you handle that?
That sort of did come up because of our heroes. Trophy Gold's very financially motivated, hence the name. And once they'd dealt with the werewolf by, burning his house down and then sort of semi-accidentally killing him, they kind of got back to town, delivered their report, and they were like, well, our job's kind of done, right? Where's our reward? As far as they were concerned, like telling the town burghers who the real villain was enough. In fact, they did eventually get persuaded to go and bring a baying mob of torch-wielding townsfolk to the apothecary's house, but only on the promise of yet more gold. I told them that the rewarding heroes budget had been used up already on them, but they were allowed to keep anything they found inside the house, and they were like, great. So that's sort of the mercenary answer, is looting. That's not the... Yeah, I'm feeling some sympathy for the author of the module. That's not the best motivation. But that's what happened.
I'm sure a lot of people would just kind of be about the story and just kind of seeing it through. Speaking of the story, the plot is very much written out, and that's the thing that drives me absolutely insane about early Das Schwarze Auge modules, is the plot is not... I mean, it reads nicely, but in-game it can be very unwieldy, I would say, because there's a lot of first this, then that, and there's not a lot of bullet points, but it's really pretty dense prose. How did you handle that in play? Did you find that unwieldy as well, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I did a bit, although I think what is good in this scenario is there are not too many triggered events, like if this, then that, because there's like, when you finish at the Herrenhaus, the manor, then you come out and there's a bunch of monsters ready to attack you. And I think that's about it. Like the rest of it doesn't move around too much in play. It's like there's locations to go to, so it's safe in that sense. It is a bit hard to untangle, though. I would often call for translation breaks in a PvP while I was going, all right, guys, it's going to take me a while to go and reread some pages to figure out what's going on. But yeah, this module, at least I would say, was relatively okay for that, because everything was in a block of about 1 paragraph or 2 usually. Although that being said, I don't think I read a single thing from the appendices, which was
they're not.
I was just like, I don't need that, I thought. But I can see how that style, if it was in a more, here's the narrative that's going to happen style, it would be almost impossible to untangle it. You'd have to read quite a few, you'd have to commit everything to memory and then refer to it again.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will talk about this a little bit later when we go into the expert delve, but I have a specific use of note-taking that worked really well for that. But yeah, it's kind of annoying. Speaking of that fight after the manor, the fight is assumed to be a non-event, and it basically just says narrate what happens. So just to give a little bit of context, the PCs are going to be confronted with the main bad guy who's bringing, inexplicably, it kind of is barely explained in the plot how that happens. A bunch of undead.
That's a good point. Yeah, I had no idea. I was very confused by how he managed that, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, right, me too.
Not just me. Right.
There are no stats for these undead, like a couple of zombies and skeletons. And it's just assumed that there's kind of a deus ex machina. How did that go down? Because I've still got that ahead of me, so I'm really interested how you handled that.
I didn't need to because my guys decided this was not a fight they were interested in and they ran away.
Oh, so... I love it. Perfect.
And then they bumped into the Inquisitor further down the road and had that little sequence. Yeah, I think just escaping is probably... I'm not sure what the function of that fight sequence even is.
Same.
It just sort of happens and there's no fallout from it really either.
Yeah, I mean, I think the purpose is that it establishes Allurius as the bad guy, but there's other scenes that do that also. I agree with you. It's not, there's not a whole big point to it. Okay, my last question. Baranos is the former priest of Boron, the god of death, that becomes the werewolf, and the players are to stab him with a dagger that we'll talk about that later, but it's made from silver, and that silver then just causes him to die within a certain period of time. Did you play it as red? Because I find that a little bit weird.
They did, actually. They were on a werewolf killing mission. They killed the werewolf. But yes, they did. Hang on, let me check. I've got a transcript of the PvP here. I think I used the phrase, he has time to get out a few stagey last words. And of course, this is where the plot gets revealed. So that's a good question. If your players somehow, like, I don't know, deal with him remotely where they can't hear what he's saying, what would happen? Because they do need him to croak out, it was this guy.
Well, there's the diary, of course.
Oh, yeah, that's right. There is the diary, yeah.
But yeah, I just found the idea that any silver touching a werewolf instantaneously causes the werewolf to die kind of a strange tenet. But yeah, I don't know if that's handled like that.
The way I pictured it was that the sort of special dagger kind of injects the silver into him in a way. Is that?
I think there's some kind of like antidote within that.
Yeah.
So let's just say that, listeners, it's a little confusing. Yeah. So the whole, werewolf death scene takes a little plotting, I would say.
Yeah, and you're right. There's no real need for him to definitely die either, so...
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, because there's some poetic justice. I mean, he meddled with the wrong side. It's, again, that didactic, pedagogical, moral play right there, right? So, interesting thing to play with as a GM.
Yeah. All right, let us move on then to the Chain Lightning round. You go first.
So I really enjoyed the Troll Garbuts, a lover of licorice and licorice root.
Oh, is that the difference between those? Okay, there's two German words that I
also
could
had
only
to look
translate
it
as
up.
licorice.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yes, we mentioned the special dagger. I liked this. It's called the Mengbilar, a fragile hollow dagger that contains a potion or other liquids. And I think that the whole thing about it being a cure or antidote was a massive lie.
I like that. Well, I really enjoyed the scene when the PCs enter the so-called night hall, kind of the main hall, and there are 7 forest wolves that have made themselves cozy on remnants of flags and curtains along the north wall.
In town, at the Temple of Boron, only 1 floor is above ground, for the cult's rites take place below the earth.
Fun fact, both dungeons have 2 basements. It's wonderful.
That is, yeah.
I also enjoy that the PCs are given a box that contains D20 plus 15 so-called Borbarat mosquitoes, deadly mosquitoes that can lead to memory loss.
And finally, there is a bottle that can be discovered labelled Rashdula Magic Potion. On closer inspection, this is a high percentage brandy.
Oh my gosh, I missed that. That's gold. I love that.
Let's move on to the Expert Delve. Okay, this episode's Expert Delve is using RPG materials in languages other than your own. Many of our Anglophone listeners may be following along if they've made it to this point thinking, this is all great, but what use is this to me? I don't speak German. Well, the interesting news, listener, is that neither do I, and yet somehow I got 3 months of PvP out of this. So
I'm really intrigued about that. Tell me how you did that.
I'll spoil that now, and although it will be making a reappearance when we talk about maybe levels of proficiency. Yeah, I don't really speak German in any meaningful sense, but I do have enough German that if I dump a paragraph of it into Google Translate, I can see where it's got it wrong and then go look up the words that it messed up. And so for the speed play-by-post turns around, that's okay. I could never do it face-to-face.
Yeah.
It would be like hours of me sitting there with my phone going, hang on, guys, hang on. I could just give me a second. And like looking things up. But yeah, when you're doing it just in text, you can get away with that. And so that's what I did. But I'd like to quickly rewind and ask the question, like, why? Why did I do this thing? I'm going to assume that as a non-native English speaker, I think for most people who are like outside the United States, a lot of role-playing game things are American, and therefore you have to deal with American materials and like gaming materials in English. But yeah, why should you or why would you use game stuff in other languages?
Well, in my case, it's an obvious answer. It's because I have a certain fondness for Das Schwarze Auge and therefore love sharing it with my friends over here in the States. But even for people who don't have that background, I think there is a certain insight into how different culture views a certain historical period, though that's obviously not a historical period, but there's obviously a lot of kind of the German idea of what the Middle Ages would look like in there. We call this period Mittelalter, which is a kind of a mashup of fantasy, and Mittelalter, which is the medieval period. And I feel like it is distinct from what I've seen in American RPGs of that sort. So I really think it's kind of fun to go like, what do Germans or French people or somebody from Japan make of this idea of kind of a magical Middle Ages time? And that is an insight you wouldn't get if you did not branch out into a different language.
In a way, it's like an expanded version of, we buy other people's adventures because we want something we wouldn't come up with ourselves.
Sure.
And in a similar way, you're like, you can expand that to something that the Anglosphere wouldn't come up with by itself as well. Yeah, there are just games in not your language you might want to play. And also, for me, I often want to share the experience of something with my friends who don't read the Portuguese. Is usually the thing. I tend to buy games from Brazil and then run them in English. But yeah, also it's just there's more stuff, I would say, is another reason.
Sure.
Artwork is completely language independent, and people often talk about how, especially French, but I think to a degree German game books have very high production values and look really cool.
These days.
Yeah, these days. Not the Wolf of Winhall, I'll tell you that much. But yeah, so that's one thing.
I mean, there's obviously a danger to take the concepts and other them or display them as exotic. So I feel like that is a potential pitfall. Since I grew up in the German culture, that may be a little bit less of an issue for me. But did you find anything there that kind of you had to stop yourself from othering?
Not that I noticed, although now I'm worried.
I think it's actually, as far as this module is concerned, that is not a huge concern, I would say. I mean, it's a couple of dungeon crawls and then villagers.
Yeah.
But I think that there might be games in other languages where that could easily happen.
In a way, you're a little on safer ground because, presumably people will not present themselves as strangely exotic and other because they don't think they are. And so all the characters in Winhall, for example, are just ordinary people. I don't think that authors think of them as anything more than, general fantasy background NPCs. And so, yeah, they're sort of, in that sense, they're immune from stereotype.
Very true, but Das Schwarze Auge has a lot of regions that are very problematic.
Oh, really?
There's a whole kind of desert folk that have a god, just the one god instead of 12. You get the idea, right? So I could go on, and there's, tribal people in the south and stuff like that. So it can get very problematic. Obviously, you're going to see the dark side of that as well. So
yeah, I suppose the trick is being aware of when people are writing about themselves and when they are not. Interesting.
One thing that I've mentioned earlier is that the dark eye is sometimes or often kind of described as the German answer to D&D. It's also a system that uses a D20, but you have to roll under instead of over, which is really interesting and throws everybody for a loop. So it's obviously another system you can experience and another way of kind of how was a role-playing game approached. And especially since this is such an old system, I think it can give kind of an interesting insight into that aspect of role-playing games. My partner always says, well, at least the system doesn't get in the way of gameplay.
Yeah.
That's as far as he'll go. But it's a bit of a clunky system, and it's gone through a lot of changes throughout the 5 editions now. But it still, offers some really interesting insights into, they did that really different. I think it's always fun to look at different systems in different ways.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting sometimes to see how different, especially linguistic spheres of gaming have latched on to different core concepts. So, for example, in Brazil, not only do they have the kind of popular homegrown systems like 3D&T, which is still knocking around, but there are also kind of English language games that got translated and have a weirdly long lifespan in Brazil and nowhere else. Like there's a game called Mortal Coils, which I think came out in the 2000s. I remembered the name, and then when I started reading Portuguese gaming stuff, I kept seeing it mentioned all the time. I was like, what? Why is this thing so... Why is there so much stuff for this game?
That is so interesting.
Like it's like an alternate timeline of when Mortal Coils took over the world, but it's only in Portuguese. It's valuable, but of course it is difficult to cross that language barrier. What do you do to make it... I'm assuming, for example, that you're running from German language books and then translating as you go when you're at the table. Is that right?
That is correct. So we are using the 5th edition rules because they were translated, and it was just too much work for me to translate my favorite version, which is the 3rd edition, into English. I was just not going to do all that legwork. So in terms of the system and the rules, I mean, we just use the English source book, which has its own issues with translation and inconsistencies, and I wish I could have edited it. But anyway, it's imperfect, but we're working with it. But yeah, I run a lot of older modules that I just have a fondness for my group, and then kind of Frankenstein them together and just have fun with it. I will always have a German text there, which is also awesome because nobody can read that, right?
So you just leave it on the table.
It's perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is really nice. But yeah, that is actually, for me, the main point I wanted to talk about, because for me, it's a lot of work. This code switching and translating over. If I'm just moving in an English-speaking realm, I'm a lot more eloquent than when I'm constantly switching over or reading something in one language and then going to the other. So I'm often very tongue-tied when I do this. So I've really started taking very detailed notes. So I make Google documents and I kind of give myself the highlights of almost every paragraph. Anything that seems like super relevant, I'll just give myself a couple of bullet points and then completely improvise from them generally. Sometimes I get myself in trouble, but it's just so much brain power to translate at the table. For you, using Google Translate, that must, as you said, it would probably be very difficult to do this in real time.
Yeah, if I'm running face-to-face, I will prep by... I don't do it as extensively as you do. I'll do a printout, usually, highlight the key things in the text in Portuguese, and crucially, still summarize. And even if it's all words I didn't have to look up, which is quite rare, because if you're running something set in the 16th century, there's usually terminology you don't know. And yeah, definitely always scribble the highlights or just like put a quick description of an NPC or key feature to remind you what's supposed to happen. Yeah, that generally works pretty well as long as you can read the text and have the key info pulled out for you by yourself in advance. That's useful. I don't really translate other things though, except sometimes for reference sheets, character sheets.
Okay.
Surprisingly, I find people struggle with character sheets.
Yeah.
I've used Portuguese stuff for the Elephant and McCall banner before, and I think for Dungeon World. And I just spent the whole session going, no, FOR is short for Forza. It means strength. You'd think, like, some of them are the same. DES for dexterity. Come on. But no one ever remembers, so...
Yeah, and names for the attributes in the Schwarze Auge, for example, are purposefully weird. They use very strange denominations because they wanted to keep them distinct from D&D, which had already been translated, right? So they had to use kind of very convoluted language. If you throw that in Google Translate, that might come up with very strange options there. But I feel like translating is kind of a super interesting point that I want to talk about. I often struggle with how much to translate. People's names, place names are the ones that obviously come to mind. I would love to hear how you handled that.
Well, people's names I basically never translate unless it's something like a nickname where they're called so and so the brave or whatnot. Right. Or sometimes I'll deliberately not translate place names as well. So in Wolf of Winhall, the first time the tavern where the player characters stay, the Grenzwacht, the first time it showed up, I did translate it. It means it's like the border guard, right?
Border Watch, yeah.
Oh, the Border Watch, yeah. Sorry, Border Guard is an East German documentary film from the 80s.
That sounds fun.
But,
I should look into it.
It's not. So,
okay.
But... It's one of those ones that's interesting rather than fun, you know. But yeah, so I translated it the first time so they knew what it meant. And then the rest of the time I just called it the Grenzwacht, which I think was partly for laziness, if I was copying and pasting from the PDF, and partly just because part of the appeal of this part of the pitch was we're going to play this German scenario. So it's nice to have these reminders of the origin of the game, especially in this one where the names of the characters are not particularly, you know, they're kind of Fantasyland names mostly. So that's good. And then a couple of times when I was doing my C&P into Google Translate, things would come up that were overly literally translated.
Yeah.
But I left them like that anyway. Oh, I think someone gets described as having a life spark at one point, which I left in because it implies a certain cosmology. The word blood grinder is used about something. There are certainly actual other ways you would normally say that in English. But because it's slightly off, like non-native in English, it gives you this sort of sense of the other, which in a fantasy setting is useful. Now, if I was running a modern-day spy thriller, I absolutely would not do that because that would be weird and counterproductive. If you're doing something like a fantasy or science fiction game, I think it's actually sort of fun and interesting to leave those like a direct calc in instead of doing it properly.
Yeah, it's really interesting because a game like Warhammer does that too, obviously. I mean, they have a lot of German names. And in Warhammer, they're always meaningful. And I hear the name and I'm like, that's the bad guy. But obviously, you might not know if you don't speak German. But Das Schwarze Auge doesn't do that because it would be too obvious. So that is really interesting, that too. My players, I mean, I obviously asked them for this podcast. That's my research bit here. I talked to them about what struck them about having a German GM and playing a German game. And they said, generally, it just felt like a game. But for them, remembering names was consistently harder than usual.
Interesting.
Because the names were different. So they had a bit of a hard time. And since you had a written format, that might be quite different because reading it might be a whole different ballgame. But when I just say them with a slight German inflection, it just didn't quite make it into the memory bank as quickly. So I often have to spell names, say them again. It's like, oh, what was that guy again? Then constantly NPCs are renamed and I'm just like, okay. Somehow the druid got named Yandahala. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. And then obviously, you know, in the next session, you pick it back up and it's like, what was that guy called again? How do you say that? And the people would write it down and go like, what? How do you pronounce that? So I do have a lot of that, actually. Just kind of people needing a little bit more prompting and more reminding.
Yeah, that's interesting because you would think that it being a fantasy setting, it wouldn't make that much difference. But I guess because it's coming from a different point of origin, the ways of constructing those names are different. There's probably a research paper in that for someone somewhere. But,
that is a good point. Yeah, I mean, as a teacher, it makes... I'm a teacher. I teach English as a second language and German, which, you know, makes me kind of perfect for this.
Yeah, it's good.
It makes complete sense just in the way the brain picks it back up, which actually I think segues very nicely into the last point you wanted to make. Because what I see in my learners is that when you have a certain level of language proficiency, you're going to understand more or less of a nuance, which can really shape your understanding of a text. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about those levels of language.
This is the practical part, I guess, of the expert delve in concrete steps with, because I think one of the most important things to do is to benchmark yourself to figure out what you can do with different levels of language ability. So you're right, like the Wolf of Winhall, I kind of had to choose that. I looked at several different adventures to run. There's a really cool one about the gods freezing a whole city in time and you have to move around
that's
frozen
fun.
Sea. Yeah. Like, it's fun, but it was like way too detailed. I remember looking at one puzzle section and thinking, I've got the answer and I don't know how to do this. Yeah, you got to sort of keep within your capabilities. And so, you know, the first level of language ability is none whatsoever. So, you know, use the pictures and the maps. Fine. But then there's another level above that. And I always try to encourage people who think they only speak one language to use this level, which is you can be able to read enough of a language to skim a Wikipedia page, find somebody's name, click it, and then switch to the English version of that page. And in this respect, learning an alphabet is useful. Okay, so my Russian is virtually nil. I know how to say, like, "Где мой паспорт?"
It's more than I have.
Yeah. Because I can read the alphabet, although I confuse certain letters all the time, Russian speakers will know which ones they are, I can skim, like, a Wikipedia page and find the names of people I'm interested in, and then follow that link and keep researching. And so that is useful because you'll often find that you're trying to find out something about, I don't know, something in medieval Europe. Switch over to French or Dutch. Look around for useful things in there. There'll often be more detail on those other language pages than there is in English, and often vice versa. English is certainly the biggest Wikipedia, but it's not uniform in how it is interested in things. The next level up, then, is knowing enough to be able to usefully read the original article on Wikipedia. And that's about the same level as I am with German.
Did you ever take German in school, formally?
No, this is the problem. No, I did French and Latin, so this is the problem.
But Latin gets you to a certain... not so much with German, no. Actually,
yeah, not so much with German.
But English does. Did you do, like, Old English?
Well, yeah, a bit of Middle... That's the thing. So, yeah, English helps you with... If you're trying to guess a German word, say it the most Anglo-Saxon way you can. If you're trying to guess a French word, say it the most Latin-y, fancy way you can, and you're probably fine.
Yeah, but it's basically just drunk Latin, French, right? Vino, vin,
I believe.
Right?
Let's... something like that. So, yeah, like if you're at that point where you can Google Translate stuff and spot when it's gone wrong, then that you can then probably do a PvP. The level above that is where you can read it, but you're going to need time to look things up in a dictionary. And slightly above that, which is where I am on Portuguese, is, I can read pretty easily while I'm at the table with someone, but I probably should have made notes earlier for complex bits or unusual vocab.
That makes sense.
And then above that, it's pretty much plain sailing. You can just do whatever you normally would. So yeah, like you've got to think about what you can make use of. And, for example, for a very short, maybe you find a 4-page dungeon that's in Spanish. I reckon you could prep that pretty easily without actually speaking Spanish yourself. It's only when you get to, I reckon the critical point is above about 12 pages in PDF, where it becomes a hassle. I don't know, what do you think about that? Where do you think the sort of levels are of using different materials?
I do think that it really depends on what kind of game you're trying to run. It's not always necessary to run a module from start to finish. Something that I'm sure not alone in that I love to do is I go like, oh, that's a really great dungeon. I'm going to rip that off. And you can take the map and then, just a couple of room descriptions and run with that and build your own story around it or put it into something that you're already doing. And it's not necessary to completely get all the nuances of everything. So I think it is possible to kind of take modules apart and just take cool stuff from them. Sometimes it's also possible to rely on kind of the kindness of friends or strangers. Somebody now who speaks German might be able to help translate, right? The internet's out there, and a lot of people do a lot of labor of love and translate things for no reason other than that it gives them joy. So there's a lot of resources out there, actually, especially, people with a deep community like the Schwarze Auge are passionate about this, so they love to help. So I'm not an exception. I was just so happy to talk about this. And there's a lot of people out there. And English is the lingua franca, right, on all those forums. I'm sure you'll be able to find speakers of a particular language that can kind of help you elevate that language level a little bit or clarify passages that might be really tough for you.
Brilliant. All right, well, let's move on then to the companion adventures. Let's start with films. I've got 2, you've got 1. So, all right, my first one is Le Pacte du Loup, Brotherhood of the Wolf from 2001. Maybe a slightly on-the-nose choice, but yeah, it's full of monster hunting, and it's kind of a wolf. Actually, it's not a wolf, is it? I've forgotten what it turns out to be. Anyway, there's a big monster. It's pretty good. It's got Marc de Cascos, the bloke from Iron Chef, doing martial arts. What more could you reasonably want? Verena, what do you have in the cinema world?
I have a movie that I did not think I would ever recommend to anyone. It is a terrible movie. It is a movie called The Wolf Man from 2010. It's got a lot of stars in it, including Benicio del Toro, Anthony Hopkins, Emily Blunt, and more. I do not know how this movie was made with this cast. It's truly terrible. But Benicio del Toro is a great conflicted werewolf, right? He's kind of turned werewolf against his will, and he plays that really well. So he could be kind of a little bit of a reference for Baranos. And Anthony Hopkins is his evil dad, who could be an excellent inspiration for Illyrius's Knight personality. In my opinion, he's got that kind of fatherly but very evil quality to him. So those might be fun references. But yeah, it's a terrible movie.
Amazing. Okay, well, I'll recommend a slightly, well, no, I think considerably from the sounds of it, better movie, which is The Reckoning from 2003. And specifically, I think a good model for, if not Dexter Nimrod himself, certainly his effect on the scenario, is the way that Matthew Macfadyen's character, McFadyen? I never know how to say that now. Anyway, he shows up, he's an inquisitor type working directly for the king, who in the midst of this mystery being solved in a medieval town, kind of shows up and alters the stakes considerably in a sort of mysterious, brusque way. Yeah, that's all on movies. You've got a couple of other recommendations though, right?
I have one recommendation that is specifically for our German listeners because it has not been translated, though I would be delighted to translate it. It's a book called Fathers of Dragons, or Drachenväter in German. It was published in 2014. I actually forgot to look up the publishing company, but the authors are Hillebrand and Lischka, and it is a book that talks about the history of role-playing games from a German perspective. And it's a great fun. It's a really good history. And then the last thing, it's not so much about this module, but more about Germanness. There is a genre of music which is noteworthy, which is medieval rock or Mittelalter rock. And there's a lot of bands like Schandmaul, Saltatio Mortis, In Extremo, Subway to Sally, Corvus Corax. It's a thing. It's a really German thing. It's basically medievally type sounds, but metal.
Right.
So it's real fun. And there's whole festivals dedicated to this. It's a real German thing. And it might give you a little bit of that feel of the German medieval fantasy world. And the song that I would like to recommend is by Cultus Ferox, and it's called The Wolf Ballad, Wolfsballade. Maybe we can link it in the show notes.
Yeah, maybe we can play it out over the credits. No, we can't do that. We don't have the rights. Okay, but anyway, yeah, well, that is our episode. So, well, thank you very much for talking about this today, Verena. We literally could not have done it without you. So, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tom, for having me on. And thanks so much to Jason for giving a spot to me today.
Okay, we're back.
Yeah. So, you've heard the whole chat that Verena and I had now. Jason, what are your thoughts?
I thought it was a really good chat. I enjoyed listening to it. Just as a personal thing, I really enjoy listening to my own things as a fan, you know, like my own podcast or watching a game that I've written be played by someone else. So that's kind of like a fun experience. Verena's terrific, really, really good on the mic. Like they've been doing it for like 100 years.
I know. So, we got really, we got really lucky with our first ever guest there. I mean, that set a very high standard for anyone who follows. Yeah. So yeah, I thought, I really enjoyed the chat. I would love to have her back on the show actually in the future if we can find, I don't know, some other excuse. That would be great.
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. Yeah. As far as the substance of what you both talked about, I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought what was most interesting to me is that Verena brought a lot of rich experience with Das Schwarze Auge, and that was awesome to hear. But importantly, it wasn't like this pure nostalgia, and it wasn't like totally glowing. Like Verena has a very good balanced sense of like, I love this thing because it's something I grew up with, but I also recognize its issues today. Yeah. Being capable of criticizing that and being able to like sort of criticize the game in that way, I think is really effective. I think it reflects very much my experience with D&D, your experience with Warhammer and things like that. Like this, you know, this is a thing we love. We clearly love it, but you know, we're doing this show in part because we think there are better ways of doing things, and that, maybe the way D&D was, 40 years ago isn't the best, even though we can still love a thing and,
right. But also,
ideas, right?
but also,
I thought Verena did a great job of that.
Yeah, and there are also things to kind of rediscover and sort of think, I didn't notice this in 1993, but actually...
Precisely,
actually, no,
yes.
it's pretty good.
Well, it's kind of like when we had that, it was the Cyberpunk module. I remember both of us were like, gosh, there were great big parts of this that work really well today. And, or like every time we look at an older thing and we're like, oh, I like how they organize the information here. No one does that way anymore. That's pretty cool. Yeah, it's both, right? It's fun to revisit things. And Verena was able to revisit this module in a way that I thought just made it a very compelling listen. And I thought your conversation about like translations and working in other languages and why you might want to do that was also very, very interesting. I don't know if it's the sort of thing that many people will do often, but it was fun to throw it out there and to go through some of it.
Hopefully what we talked about kind of illustrates that there are things that you can do with foreign language materials, even if you aren't going to sit there and read a massive 300-page book in Portuguese or Polish or whatever. I have two questions for you on this. Like, do you feel that you would be more confident about maybe grabbing something in a... Well, I mean, you have a bit of Italian, right? Do you feel like you might kind of approach some...
I do speak a little bit of Italian. I do speak a fair amount of Spanish. And I don't know if I would feel... I don't know if comfortable is the right way of putting it. Like, okay, I definitely would feel comfortable doing this. But I think I could do it. Yeah. I actually think that some of the tips that you both discussed were really, really helpful. Even just the sort of like basic... kind of upfront tip of choose something fairly small.
Yeah, that's
right? Like,
that's the main one. Yeah.
Right? Like 10, 12 pages max, right? That sounds about right. I thought that was super helpful. But also, one of the things that I think is really important and that I've learned, I'm a guest this year at 3W6Con, which is a...
that sounds like German for 3W6.
Story game convention. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a story game convention put on by this podcast. It's German language. We're partially English, mostly German language story game podcast, 3W6. What I've discovered is that community very like excitedly grabs games in English and makes it work, right? They work it out. And that's maybe partly because they don't have a choice, because like you both talked about, many of the publications are not just English, but they're American publications.
Well, that's the thing. They're often American to a point that it makes it difficult for Irish or British gamers or Australians to follow.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So there's a whole other layer there, right? As a guest, they've been so accommodating of like making sure I have everything that I need to like, to run my game in English for their convention, to do my panel at their convention. And there is a certain level of the communities out there want to be helpful. Like you mentioned on the show, they are willing to help you with the resources they have. And we should try too, right? Like, I mean, it's on us to sort of like try. And I think it just creates a good cross-cultural, cross-language.
Yeah, and that's genuinely the tip
thing,
from Verena that really I hadn't thought of and just delighted me when she said it, is just ask people for help. Anyone listening to this, if you need a page or two of a Portuguese game sorted into English for you, just find me on Twitter. That's fine. Because it's kind of fun. It's kind of your hobby anyway, and as long as it's not going to get into a novel-length piece of work, then of course people are happy to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an enjoyable listen, though. I really, really liked it. And like you said, we should definitely have Verena on again. With all that said, listeners, we hope you enjoyed this. This was a special episode. It was great fun. I want to extend my thanks to Verena for being on the show and bringing their insights to all of this. And I also want to close by saying that Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. We can be found on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We're on Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. A quick note here. We put out this magazine called Codex. It's awesome. But right now in Codex, we've just kicked off this Trophy Gold incursion publication plan. There's a very aggressive Trophy Gold publishing thing going on in Codex right now, where we're publishing other people's incursions. And the one that we have in the feed right now, Codex Leviathan, has 3 Trophy Gold incursions. They're all awesome. So you've heard me talk about Trophy Gold a lot on this program, so maybe go check out that issue of Codex. You get that for a $6 pledge on the Patreon. And Tom, as always, thanks so much to you.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks especially in this episode to our incomparable editor, Rich Rogers, who has been working pretty hard stitching these segments of different people in different rooms talking to each other. So
this is a particularly challenging episode.
So thank you very much, Rich. And thank you for listening, listeners.
Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that Hearts of Wulin is now available to pre-order. Hearts of Wulin is a tabletop role-playing game of wuxia melodrama, powered by the apocalypse. In Hearts of Wulin, players take the role of skilled martial artists in a world of rival clans, conspiracies, and obligations. The game emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Chinese wuxia TV series like The Smiling Proud Wanderer and Fox Volant of the Snowy Mountain, and Chinese martial arts novels from the second half of the 20th century. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. Everyone has ties to factions, loves they can't quite express, and secrets which will shake them to their core. As in the source material, stories in Hearts of Wulin are driven by the characters' duties, romantic desires, and entanglements with other characters. You can pre-order the hardcover edition of Hearts of Wulin by following the link in the show notes. And as always, thanks so much for your support.